I will tell you about Wittenoom, a city located in the northwestern part of Australia, in the heart of the desert. It was once one of the most important projects in the country's history, a dream city that attracted people from all over the world. But today Wittenoom is a ghost town, abandoned by all the inhabitants, with abandoned houses. Officially, the city no longer exists, it has been removed from all maps. Staying here is dangerous for life, the land, plants, air, everything can be deadly. Wittenoom is Australia's Chernobyl, the worst disaster in the country's history and one of the most dangerous places on the planet. However, it wasn't radiation that destroyed this city. What happened here? The year is 1958. North Hamersley Grain, the town where Wittenoom originated. The 1950s. The McKenna family decides to start a new life. Philip and his wife Esther and their children are moving to a small town in Western Australia where hundreds of similar families from all over the world are settling. It was an unusual place. The Wittenoom began to be built after World War II for people who would work at the local mine. The world was recovering from the war, Australia was barely affected, and its business was going particularly well. The economy grew, new enterprises appeared, and workers were constantly needed. There used to be nothing on this place, but now hundreds of people have been brought here, and an entire city has been built specifically for them. The McKenna family was one of the first to settle there. Philip was offered a driver's position and a very good salary. He and his wife were just expecting their third child, and such conditions were a great opportunity for a young family. Although, of course, they took a lot of risks, because the west of Australia is not the most pleasant place on earth. It's unbearably hot there, and the nearest town is 200 kilometers away. Unsurprisingly, almost no one used to live here. But now houses with air conditioners and washing machines have been built in Wittenoom. A theatre, a cinema hall, a hotel, and a hospital were opened in the middle of the desert. These were incredible conditions for ordinary workers. People from all over the world moved to Wittenoom. More than half of the residents were migrants, Dutch, Czechs, Italians. Therefore, there was a special atmosphere in the city. All the neighbors knew each other, their children went to the same school, and the adults went on vacation together. In the evenings, we gathered on the verandas, listened to music, and danced. Cricket tournaments and even horse races were held several times a year. Many people have really found their happiness here. The time of hope has come. Wittenoom was a utopian city. Newspapers called this city a symbol of the future of Australia. A new era was about to begin here for the whole region, and maybe for the whole country. Wittenoom was supposed to be the Dubai of its time, an oasis in the middle of the desert, a new Shangri-La, an example of what man is capable of. But this city wasn't built with oil money. In Wittenoom, they earned money in a different way, they mined asbestos here. Asbestos has been known to people for a long time, it was called a miracle mineral. Asbestos can be divided into fibers and made into fabric. But the main miracle was something else, asbestos does not burn. At first, people thought it was magic. Priests and shamans used asbestos to perform miracles with fire. Marco Polo wrote about magical Mongolian fabrics that you can wear to the campfire. But soon this funny curiosity for shamans will become one of the most sought-after minerals on Earth. The Industrial Revolution began in the 19th century. Factories and machines appeared, in which something was constantly burned and melted. The material, which does not burn, withstands high temperatures, does not pass electricity, and has high strength, has become a real salvation. It was used as protection from fire, and everyone needed asbestos. By the 20th century, it had literally become a strategic resource. Asbestos was necessary for every country that wanted to develop in a new era. The two world wars only fueled demand. Asbestos was used in aircraft engines, in tank linings, and on ship decks. It was even used to produce antibiotics. After the Second World War, asbestos entered everyday life. It was used to make clothes for firefighters, and it was added to the concrete cement used to build new houses, to bricks and pipes in these houses, to furniture, irons, heaters in apartments, and to brake pads and clutch discs in cars. Vinyl records and even cigarette filters were made from it. Practically no production in the world could do without asbestos. The demand for it exceeded the supply. It was a very profitable business. Although in business it is important not only to make a profit, but also to manage finances correctly. So, continuing the story. Asbestos was very popular, but there were only a few deposits in the world, in Canada, in the Urals, in South Africa. And in the 40s, asbestos was found in Australia. These were gigantic deposits. In the middle of the desert, where there was practically nothing before, new gold was found. Moreover, it was blue asbestos, which is especially scarce in the world. The reserves of Wittenoom turned out to be so large that it would be enough for the whole world for a very long time. Australia was supposed to become the main centre of production of the most sought-after mineral on Earth. And who got this lucrative business? Who got the opportunity to earn more than on gold? The answer might surprise you. It was the Colonial Sugar Refining Company. Caesar was established 100 years prior by an immigrant from Denmark, Edward Knox. In just a few years, his business grew to a massive scale. Caesar operated in several countries and controlled the entire sugar business in Australia. Money flowed like a river. Over the years, the Colonial Sugar Refining Company passed down to Edward Knox's children and grandchildren. The heirs began to expand the business, just as asbestos was discovered in Australia. Caesar bought the mine and had high hopes for it. They were confident that asbestos would become in the 20th century what sugar was in the 19th, a source of endless profit. There was only one problem: the mine was located in the middle of a hot desert. But Caesar was so wealthy that it overcame even that. They built houses with air conditioners, paid high salaries, and transported workers on airplanes with free drinks on board. Can you imagine how complex the task was? Transferring people from all corners of the globe to work in one place. In the 50s, when every receipt and ticket had to be kept for reporting. Though, I'm sure even today someone runs their business that way. But I can't even imagine who that is, some dinosaurs among entrepreneurs. After all, now everything can be done much more easily and conveniently. The Colonial Sugar Refining Company created ideal conditions in Wittenoom because the town was meant to become the most profitable business in the country, if not the world. But few of the workers thought about that. For them, Wittenoom was primarily a chance for a happy life. Years passed. Philip and Esther had 3 more children. The older daughters grew up and married workers like themselves. They had their own children. The McKenna family firmly established themselves in Wittenoom and turned into an entire dynasty. And Philip was promoted and now worked as a shift supervisor right at the mine itself. And production constantly grew. The demands were high because the business had to be profitable. Workers were forced to stay overtime and conditions in the mine were not the best. It was hot, cramped, and dusty. People sat hunched over for hours, crushing stones. Everything around was covered in asbestos. Workers could barely see their hands and couldn't even recognize their partner's face. This was the downside of life in the beautiful town, and not everyone could withstand it. Many left, some ran away. The turnover of people was very high, and with each year, finding new workers became more difficult. Australians already knew the conditions they would have to work in Wittenoom, so it was easiest to bring Europeans here, as many of them didn't fully understand where they were going. The fate of Wittenoom began to change in the 60s. One evening, Philip and Esther were visited by their daughter, Valerie. She said she was leaving the town. Her husband was not feeling well, he coughed a lot. Doctors advised him to find another job and move closer to the ocean. Valerie didn't know that the move wouldn't help and that her husband wasn't the only person in Wittenoom who was starting to have health problems. All these years, a real battle had been going on in Australia around this town because many doctors were already calling it one of the most dangerous places on Earth. And the reason was asbestos. Besides all its amazing properties, asbestos has another characteristic: it is incredibly dangerous. Its dust quickly penetrates the lungs. These are tiny particles that cannot be seen. They remain in the body forever and damage it from the inside. This disease is called asbestosis. And scientists had known about it for a long time, since the 19th century. The first fatality was recorded in 1907. In the US, people who worked with asbestos had long been denied health insurance. The risks were considered too high. And in the 50s, British doctors stated without a doubt that asbestosis causes lung cancer. That is, when the first workers were just arriving in Wittenoom, all this was already known. But no one warned them about the danger. Many years later, all these people would ask what the CSR company really knew. All these years, a doctor regularly flew to Wittenoom to monitor working conditions. And as it would later turn out, he immediately understood what it all threatened. He saw a mine filled with asbestos dust. It was everywhere, and workers breathed it every day. In his very first report, this doctor called Wittenoom the most dangerous mine in the world and warned that it would become the largest epicenter of asbestosis in history. But nothing changed. Years passed, other doctors came to Wittenoom more than once, and all spoke of the same thing. The devices that measured the amount of dust in the air here simply broke down. The readings exceeded the norm by 100 times, and with each year, the situation worsened. The true scale of the disaster would be known much later, but before that, Wittenoom was to face another shock. In 1966, CSR announced that it was closing the mine, but not because of health risks. The business simply never became profitable. Asbestos was gradually losing out to cheaper alternatives, being replaced by synthetic materials, mineral wool, and fiberglass. The price of asbestos was falling, and the cost of extraction was constantly rising. Supplies from the hot desert of Australia simply proved unprofitable. These conditions never justified themselves. CSR was losing hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. But for hundreds of people in Wittenoom, the news of the mine's closure came as a real shock. Some had lived here for 20 years and could no longer imagine themselves anywhere else. Some, on the contrary, had just moved in and were hoping for a happy future. Although, of course, no one was going to close the town itself. All the people could stay and live in Wittenoom. But very soon, no one would want to at all. Because around the same time that the mine was closed for financial reasons, doctors made another important discovery. It turned out that asbestosis was not the worst thing at all. They discovered another disease that they didn't know about before, a deadly disease caused by asbestos dust. Mesothelioma is one of the most dangerous forms of cancer. Doctors describe it as being like pouring concrete into a person's lungs. Mesothelioma manifests itself decades after contact with asbestos. It is impossible to cure. And people with the diagnosis, on average, live less than a year. Now not only workers were at risk, but even those who were simply nearby, their family members, their children. Because all of Wittenoom was thoroughly saturated with dust. The wind brought it from the mine into the town. Every day, workers returned home in dirty clothes. Dust lay on windows, on cars, and on playgrounds. Some children even made chewing gum out of asbestos dust. All this time, Wittenoom was a time bomb, but it took decades to realize this. By the 80s, the terrible diagnosis was confirmed in hundreds of people from Wittenoom. Some of them had spent only a couple of months in the town. When the scale of the disaster became clear, lawsuits began in Australia. Hundreds of claims were filed, which were considered for years. The case reached the Supreme Court. Representatives of CSR at the hearings said that they knew about the danger of asbestos, but hoped that the disease only threatened those who had worked in the mine for decades. It was obvious that they were wrong. The Colonial Sugar Refining Company paid out tens of millions of dollars to the victims, but not all of these people lived to see the end of the proceedings. And some lost altogether, because CSR was only responsible for the workers they hired. Their wives and children were not entitled to payments. Philip McKenna died of mesothelioma in 1970. His wife Esther 5 years later with the same diagnosis. All their daughters lost their husbands, and Valerie became one of those who tried to seek justice. Valerie herself did not live to be 50. From the large McKenna family in this photograph, no one remained alive. Over all these years, 20,000 people lived and worked in Wittenoom. At least 2,000 of them died from diseases caused by asbestos. Currently, the World Health Organization considers asbestos hazardous to health. It has been recognized as a first-level carcinogen. Dozens of countries around the world have banned the extraction and use of asbestos, including Australia itself. But not all. In some countries, they say that the danger of this mineral has not been proven or is exaggerated. Currently, Russia and Kazakhstan extract the most asbestos in the world. Wittenoom has turned into a ghost town. Much there looks like it did 60 years ago, when people still lived here. But being there even today is dangerous to health. Millions of tons of asbestos still lie on the surface near the mine. The wind still spreads dust around, which can still be deadly. Only 2 people refused to leave the town until the very end, despite orders from the authorities. Both were evicted from there several years ago. Now the entire area around the town is a prohibited zone, and travel there is forbidden. This is the largest contaminated area in the southern hemisphere and one of the largest in the world. Wittenoom no longer exists, neither in documents nor on the map. Thus ended the story of the Dream City, which was once a symbol of hope for an entire country and generation, but turned into the biggest disaster in the history of Australia.